Okay, now let's take a look at the multiplier effect with some numerical examples. Just to rehash what we left off with in the last video, when it comes to fiscal policy, the government can change spending or taxes, and therefore we have a spending multiplier and a tax multiplier. If the government changes government spending, we would just multiply that change by the spending multiplier to get the total change in real GDP. Whereas if the government changes taxes, then we would multiply the change in taxes by the tax multiplier to get the total change in real GDP. Let's take a look at number 1 of this application. It says, if the marginal propensity to consume is equal to 0.75, how much of a tax cut would the government have to grant to stimulate the economy by $100 billion? For this type of question, we use the same process we've done with past applications, the mathematical process. Step 1, identify the appropriate mathematical model. Step 2, plug in what you know. And step 3, solve for what you don't know. So for step 1, which of these formulas is going to be most appropriate? And the answer is the tax cut, the tax formula, because it says here how much of a tax cut would the government have to grant. So that leads us to this formula right here. Step 2, now that we know the formula, let's plug in what we know. Well, we know that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.75, and we know that the government wants to stimulate the economy by 100 billion. So it looks like we're going to plug in 0.75 here into our numerator. Actually, it's going to be negative 0.75. I'll replicate this down here. So we're going to have negative 0.75. And our marginal propensity to save can easily be derived by just taking the number 1 and subtracting 0.75 from it. So that's 0.25. Remember, the MPC and MPS must sum to 1. So if you have a 0.75 MPC, you must have a 0.25 MPS. Okay. So that gives us our tax multiplier. But then we also need to plug in the $100 billion that the government wants to stimulate the economy by. That's over here. That's the total change in real GDP, 100 billion. Now, we're solving for the change in taxes. Okay, so I'm going to use delta for change in T. So this is our formula. The change in T multiplied by the tax multiplier must equal 100. Now, we want to solve for the change in T, so we need to take this multiplier and divide it into 100. So we end up with the change in taxes is equal to 100 divided by negative 0.75 over 0.25. Now, of course, this is the change in taxes is equal to 100 divided by negative 0.75 over 0.25 is negative 3. So that leads us to the change in taxes is equal to 100 divided by negative 3, which is 33.3. In other words, I'm sorry, I should correct that. It's a negative here, so this should be negative 33.3. In other words, the government would need to cut taxes by $33 billion in order to get a $100 billion fiscal stimulus. All right, let's go ahead and look at the second question. It says, if the marginal propensity to save is 0.4, how much would real GDP in the economy increase if the government spends $100 billion more on a new interstate highway project? Well, we identify the appropriate formula. This is about government spending, so we're going to use this formula here. And we know what the MPS is, so we're going to have this number here. And we also know that the government is spending $100 billion more. So we're going to have this number here. So let's go ahead and put those in there. The change in government spending is 100 billion. That's going to get multiplied by 1 over the MPS, which is given to us, 0.4. And that's going to equal, well, 100 times 1 over 0.4. 1 over 0.4 is 2.5. You can confirm that with a calculator. So 1 divided by 0.4, you get 2.5. And so 100 times 2.5 is 250. So in other words, if the government spends 100 billion on this new highway project, then they will actually stimulate 250 billion in total GDP. All right, let's go on to the third one. For the third one, it says if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, and the government wishes to increase real GDP by $25 billion, how much of a tax cut or spending increase will they need to enact? Well, this one is actually going to require that we use both formulas because it's talking about a tax cut and a spending increase. Let's start with the government spending formula. So we know that the marginal propensity to consume is 0.9. Okay? And it also tells us how much they want to increase real GDP. So we're going to be able to derive the multiplier and the change in real GDP. Then we're going to solve for the government spending that would be necessary to achieve that. Okay? So let's plug this in. So we'll put the change in delta, change in government spending, okay, multiplied by 1 over, since the MPC is 0.9, the MPS is going to be 0.1. And we know that that's going to equal the change in real GDP, which it gives us is 25 billion. So we have the change in government spending multiplied by 1 over 0.1 should equal 25. So given that, we would say the change in government spending, and to do this we would follow the same mathematical procedure. We'd take 25 and divide it by 1 over 0.1. So it's going to be equal to 25 divided by 1 over 0.10, which is 10. So that means you're going to have the change in government spending is equal to 25 over 10, which equals 2.5. And so the change in government spending would be 2.5 billion. In other words, if they want to stimulate the economy by 25 billion, they're going to have to spend 2.5 billion to do that. The autonomous effect will be 2.5 billion, and then you'll get that induced effect, and that will total 25 billion. Now, what if they want to use tax policy? If they want to use tax policy, then we can use this formula here. I'm going to put the change in taxes multiplied by negative MPC, which is 0.9, over MPS, which is 0.10, and that will need to equal 25. Okay. Now, we simply take that, see the change in taxes needs to equal 25 divided by, now this, negative 0.9 over 0.1, that's actually going to be negative 9. Okay. So following the same steps, the change in taxes would need to equal 25 over negative 9, which would equal, if we do the math here, we're going to get 25 divided by negative 9, 2.77. I mean, round up to 2.78, which equals, and it's negative 2.78. In other words, the government would need to lower taxes by 2.78 billion to get a change in real GDP of positive 25 billion. Always be careful with taxes because they move inversely to the policy. If the government is trying to increase real GDP, they need to lower taxes. Like here, decrease taxes to get a higher GDP. Whereas when they were implementing spending policy, they needed to increase spending by 2.5 billion to get the same 25 billion increase in GDP. Two routes to the same end. The government to get a $25 billion stimulus to the economy. They could cut taxes by 2.78, or they could increase spending by 2.5. Now, why the difference? Why is it that if they spend money, they actually have to spend less to get the economy stimulated by 25 billion than if they lowered taxes? If they lowered taxes, they got to drop them 2.78. Well, it goes back to the point that when they give people money to spend, people only spend a fraction of that, the marginal propensity to consume. So, for example, if the government gives you $2.78 billion in tax rebates, you're going to spend, marginal propensity to consume is 0.9, you're going to spend 90% of that, so multiply by 0.9, which means essentially